Hello, Mark Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore here. In this video, I want to talk about the pianism, the way I adapted my composition for Dad for the piano. I say adapted; it was intended from the beginning to be a piano piece, but as I've related elsewhere, it really started its life in a lead sheet form. When I wrote the melody, I wrote it at the piano, and I had a pretty clear idea of how I wanted to actually play it. But I didn't work it all out note for note. I just wrote down the chord symbols because I was under time constraints. And so I practiced it enough to have a pretty good idea of how I wanted it played, and then, how it came out is how it came out. And then I went back to the piano later and actually tried to write it all out. I didn't try to write out as I played it at the funeral. I tried to reconstruct kind of what I would have liked to have played had I really taken the time to work everything out. So I just want to talk about what some of these things really are. And I've alluded to some of these before, but I want to kind of focus on them a little bit more. So one of the things that I said that I wanted to do was capture a kind of organic feel rhythmically. In other words, I didn't want just a repeating rhythmic form. I mentioned how this was kind of based on the Sonata Pathétique second movement. The ideas behind it are similar to, I'm going for a similar vibe, not to how Beethoven wrote the piece as much as my adaptation of it, my jazz adaptation of it. So one of the things is Beethoven's was a very repeated pattern. Bing, ging, 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 right? A repeating pattern in the inner voices, back and forth, arpeggiating a chord basically. And that's not what I wanted. I wanted the flow of the eighth notes without that sort of repetition. And so that's what I'm giving you here. It's eighth notes in the bass, eighth notes in the bass, eighth note in the melody, and then eighth notes being passed back and forth between the bass and the melody. Back to the bass, melody, bass, right? So it's kind of, the motion is being passed around a little bit, but overall, it's a fairly consistent flow of eighth notes, other than the places where I chose to let it breathe. And to be honest, I considered having the entire first A section simpler than this. I considered having the whole first A section really just half notes, or maybe at most a quarter note type of pulse. I considered it strongly, and I still kind of second guess that, because as it is right now, if I'm going to critique my own piece, I would say it's a little too stagnant. There's not enough variety between the A sections, at least the first two A sections. It's not a big problem or anything, but it's definitely something that I may on a different day have chosen to do differently. What actually happened though is, if I tried playing it really simply as just the half notes and the quarter notes, it just felt, I can't even put into words, but it felt too much like I was just writing an exercise to play half notes. It didn't feel like what I wanted to play. What I wanted to play was this flowing thing. So, I don't know, a chorale is fine, and writing a chorale where you're basically writing your melody in half notes and the accompaniment is then all half notes also, it's a fine style of writing, but it felt too disjointed to me to go from there to the flowing eighth notes. I probably, with more work, could have made it work. But what I chose instead was to just change subtly. In Beethoven's version, he changed the octave. He actually took the second A section up an octave melodically, and then changed, thickened the voicing a little bit. I didn't do that because where my melody is, like in Beethoven's version, in Beethoven's version, did he go up an octave? Yeah, I'm pretty sure he went up an octave. That's because it's over here. So his version, the second A section, is up an octave from the first, but his melody is lower than mine. His original melody is hanging out around middle C. My melody is hanging out a little higher to begin with. Could I have taken the whole thing down an octave? Well, yes, I probably could have, and I didn't try that, to be honest. But I could have. But I probably wouldn't have been able to have as much of this sort of flow. I would have been more limited to these sort of repeating patterns as far as a way to express that flow. I like this broader arpeggio, these root 5 root, and elsewhere I have roots and tenths and other types of patterns that aren't just roots and fifths like that. Here's the third, the root, and the fifth here. Right? So I have a subtler difference between my first A section and my second. Let's hear these first two measures. Now let's hear the second A section. So they're very, very similar, right? But one thing I changed was that first note in the left hand. Instead of being B flat in this octave, it's B flat in that octave. I can't quite sing that B flat, but it's an octave lower, right? It's an octave lower here, and I introduced this counter melody, I guess you'd call it, in the middle voice. My original middle voice was F, F, D, flat, D as quarter notes, and it's just kind of buried in there. But in the second A section, I actually introduced more motion, more melodic interest in that inner voice. So I introduced a little bit more motion. I actually thought about keeping those eighth notes going throughout. It was actually distracting when I did it. I just didn't like it. So I introduced it in that first measure, and then I cut it out. But I did make a few other allowances. Like in the first phrase, that little melody, if you think about that as a melody, F, D, E flat, D, E flat, C, C, there's that repeated C. That's not melodic enough for me. So in this version, it's F, D, F, E flat, D, F sharp, and I don't resolve that F sharp, so sue me. Then it's E flat, C, D. I go to a D here instead of a C. This chord here is an E flat chord, and it's an E flat chord, and I'm voicing it with a sixth. The C is the sixth. The F is the ninth. It's a 6-9 chord. It's a real typical jazz sound for the 4 chord, or the 1 chord for that matter. When you hear it, there's no third in it until the second half of the beat. But it's that sound with the 6th and the 9th, and doesn't have the major 7th. I actually didn't like it with a major 7th. I tried it here, and I didn't like that sound as much, so I left it here. I left it there as a C. But when I was in this version where I'm trying to bring out this inner voice, I wanted to hear that D. And so in order for me to be okay with that, I also balanced it a little bit more with a G here. Remember, the original version in the first phrase doesn't have the G until the middle of the beat. But this version has the G right on the beat, and that to me was a sound that worked for me. And here again, I'm going to a lower octave here in the bass, and then the same in the next measure, right? There's this little line, but this version, so this left hand here is deeper than the left hand was here, versus, so this one ends on the low note, this one doesn't, but that's okay. It's got the lower note right there at the beginning. It's a bit rangier, and it's setting up a lower version of the next measure. Whereas this version doesn't get as deep. So it's fairly subtle things like that I spent quite a while trying to craft in these. This was actually the last section I completed, because I knew it was going to be hard. I knew I had my work cut out for me, making it be. I didn't want to go wildly different, because the last A section is wildly different, right? It's 16th notes. It's got that whole arpeggio. all this big romantic stuff going on. And my second A section, I didn't want identical to the first, but I wanted it subtly different, and I knew it was going to take some time to work out. So it was these 8 bars here. The second A section was the last part of the piece for me to complete. I think I tweaked things elsewhere later, but as far as like where I had just nothing but a lead sheet staring at me and some blank staff paper, this was the last part to get filled in. So there's all sorts of really specific things I'll cover separately, like when I mentioned that voicing there, and some of the things that I do voicing wise, with this lovely crunchy diminished chord voicing. There's all sorts of like detail things like that I'll talk about in another video, talking about voicing and stuff. But here I just really want to focus on this big picture pianism kind of stuff. As another example of that, here's the second 4 bars in the first A section. At least that's bar 5. Here's bar 5 of the second A section. So again, I'm going for the lower bass note, but I've also reintroduced this moving 8th note line, right? Because there is no moving 8th note line in the alto part, right? It's the bass has that moving part, but the alto part, if we want to call it that, is G, E flat, D, something like that. It's more static. This is A flat, E flat, G, B flat, and then it's really about this G here. So there's more motion. There's boom, bing, ding, ding, right? It's that moving, and it's these two voices moving together. The bass is moving in 8th notes like it did before, but before I let there be a breath on beat 2, right? Breath. But here I didn't want the breath, right? I've established more of the motion, so I want less breathing. Every single 8th note is accounted for in that measure, whereas in the first A section, I let there be an 8th note with nothing on it. In beat 2, there's nothing on the and of 2, but in the 5th measure of the second A section, I play through that. And this little device here, it's arpeggiating a chord. This is an F minor chord. These are the upper extensions of the chord, right? This is the 7th, the 9th, and the 11th. And the left hand has the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th. They're like a 10th apart. And so like the left hand, if you think of it, I think of it as the left hand is lagging behind the right. The right hand starts right off on the E flat. The left hand brings in the E flat half a beat later. And so there's this sort of interesting stair-steppy thing that's happening, where the left hand plays a note that the right hand just played, but an octave lower. And therefore the two hands are a 10th apart, moving in thirds, arpeggiating upper extensions of a chord. This is a Bill Evans device. It's one that I learned from his composition My Bells that I've discussed elsewhere. So those sorts of details were important to me, having that inner voice motion, and I do the same in the bridge of keeping this inner voice moving so that it doesn't just stop there. There's not just a quarter note and a quarter note, but the 8th notes keep moving kind of throughout that part, other than where I want it to breathe. At the end of those 4 bars, that last quarter note gets to breathe. You might think these are like trivial details, but they're not. They're kind of important details. And I'm not saying that it had to go this way, but attention to these details does pay off. It really does bring your music to the next level, by really thinking about where you're breathing and where you're not. And this is something, as a jazz musician, I'm constantly improvising, and so I might breathe in different places every time I play it. It's actually a challenge for me to commit to saying, this is where I want those breathing places to be. This is where I want that extra motion to be. This is where I want that thing to happen. As a jazz musician, I'm so used to improvising those, it's hard for me to accept that I'm going to set it down on paper once and for all time. But, it's a good challenge to then think about it and make the best decisions you can. So, so the rest of the bridge kind of plays out. And here is where I do let the motion stop completely. At the end of the bridge, quarter notes, quarter notes. And a little more motion. And then again, quarter notes. So it really breathes a lot at the end of that bridge. And this bridge is a 12-measure bridge. I didn't do that because Beethoven did it. Beethoven's B section was 12 bars long also. I just did it because it seemed like it was going to make sense here. But my bridge is 12 measures long, starting at bar 17 there. 8 measures would have been over here at bar 24. Oh, actually, it's 10, not 12. But whatever. It's got a little extra length to it, just because it felt like it needed it. It felt like it needed that extra breathing, and that's kind of where those quarter notes came from. Now, I will say, coming out of this really quiet, slow passage here, and then immediately jumping into the 16ths, this was a call that I'm not entirely comfortable with that either. It's kind of like me saying I kind of thought I wanted a chorale opening, but I just couldn't make it work. I really also second guess myself on the 16th. I mean, I want that motion. I want that sense of whatever, that, Chopin-esque type, or Debussy or whatever, these not that Beethoven wouldn't have used arpeggios like that also, but it does change the character of the piece, right? And I debated whether I wanted that, and whether I wanted it juxtaposed against those quarter notes, or whether I wanted to somehow build more of a transition into that. Again, I sort of ran out of time. No, I mean, when I wrote this whole thing out, I could have added measures. I could have chosen to deviate from my lead sheet. But in the end, I don't dislike how it works. But it's definitely one you have to think harder about playing the piano. I say this as someone who's played it on the piano, how to sell that transition from this part and then going into this 16th note part, and make that sound like something other than a cheap trick of building intensity, because that's what it is, but it's a good one. So it puts the burden on the pianist to really make that make sense, I think. And again, it's a small detail. No, this is an obvious thing, right? Going from quarter notes to 16th notes is a big thing. And I had to think about whether I really wanted that to happen, or whether I wanted to somehow ease into it. And I convinced myself I could make it work, but it's definitely a concern. So I also had to think about, do I want steady 16ths, or do I want to allow the 16ths to eighth, 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 quarter. And it's because I don't like having to play steady 16ths in my left hand. That's really what it came down to. I could have done that. Totally could have done that. The way I got away with it in the first measure is my right hand takes over, right, the last couple of 16ths. That's why I notated it with cross-staff notation here. Actually, these two are also in that hand. I should notate it that way. Well, whatever. I'll change that later if I think of it. But that's how I'm playing it. Because the right hand is just playing these long notes, I've got fingers left over to let it take up those last two 16ths. So my left hand can get back down and play the next low note. If your left hand is having to play all those 16ths up the arpeggio and then jump back down, it's awkward. I don't like it. And again, it's coming from my experience improvising this kind of stuff. You do what comes easily to you as a pianist, because that's what you do. If you're improvising it. So when I write, I try to write with that same mentality of write in a pianistic way, write something that feels natural. I'm not saying it doesn't require practice, but at least it feels natural. So I let there be in places where the right hand is moving and can't help with the arpeggio so much. I let the left hand just go to eighth notes. And now here I let the left hand continue with all this stuff, right? I really wanted another 16th right there. I really kind of wanted another 16th, like, say, this. But it just doesn't feel quite right to me pianistically. I could have changed the way this is arpeggiated, but I really liked this descending line because I didn't originally have it. I had this line continuing to ascend and then jump down. I really like that descending line because it echoes what happened in the previous measure. Descending, right? So it's got that shape to it that gave it some interest also. So I'm not going to claim this is the most well-crafted measure I've ever written. It's not. It's one that if I were to keep working this piece, I might see if I could find another solution to the left hand here that didn't kind of stop there. It's not bad. It's not bad, but it's not ideal. It's not as really perfect as I might have wanted it to be. And when I improvise this, if I improvise from that same lead sheet, I would probably play this a little differently and maybe find something else that works better for me. I don't know. But anyhow, that's kind of what's going on here. There's, I guess, one last thing to show you, and that's this quarter note passage. At the end of the A section, I originally was playing that all quarter notes, including the left hand together, and it was too static for me. So that's why I went with this back and forth between the left and the right hand. Except my hands are backwards from what I'm actually playing. If you're watching my hands and wondering, well, he's playing the left hand when it should be the right, it's because I'm off. So that's something I did, but I do it a little differently at the end. I let it synchronize again, because here again I'm expanding it. It's an 8-bar A section, but I've expanded it with like an extra little tag, extended the length of it, and now I'm letting there be a note on the beat in the left hand, right? There was no note on beat 3 in this measure. But this measure gets the note, the left hand. I mean, there's no note in the left hand on beat 3. It's just tied over from the end of 2. But in this measure, I let it come there because I let it kind of, the two hands come together there because it just felt right. It's a small detail that matters. That is what you will hear me, what you have heard me saying over and over again. And in writing music like this, it really... Some of it's about these big picture ideas of your melody and your form, and sometimes it's about these small details of how you get your finger in position to do this and which finger can move to do that, and when you're going to introduce this tiny little 2-note thing that's not even the melody but somehow feels important. So there's a lot of those details here that I've been focusing on. So that's I guess the main things that I want to be showing you about this piece, what I'm doing pianistically on it. There's a lot of places where I'm having to work a little bit, like here, holding 2 notes down in my left hand while as a half note, while another note moves, like the middle finger comes up and then goes up to the E, and I had to think about exactly how that would work with my hand and whether this was going to make me happy. But these were the notes I wanted sustained, the G and the B and the D flat, not the B flat, because the B flat is doubled in the melody. And so another one of those small details that I really had to work out exactly how it was going to happen at the piano. And again, I'll talk more about that voicing in another video where I will just focus on some real specific voicing choices that I made. So I'm just doing this whole series of things, hoping that by looking at the same piece from a lot of different angles, you can maybe see a lot of different ways of looking at your own music and ways of developing your own music. So thanks for listening.